Welcome to More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Today we are recording from Astoria, Queens, Bellingham, Washington, and Alexander, Virginia. Our guest is Phillip Merrick. Phillip, introduce yourself.
Thank you, JD. Great to be here. So I am Phillip Merrick, CEO and co-founder of pgEdge.
According to this, you are also a serial entrepreneur, a technologist, board member, and advisor. Talk to me a little bit. We'll have plenty of time for pgEdge, but talk to me a little bit about this serial entrepreneur.
Maybe it has something to do with an inability to work for somebody else, something like that. But no, more seriously, I've had the great fortune to have stumbled into entrepreneurship and have, by last count, co-founded and or run something like 6 or 7 different startup companies over the last 25 odd years. I started out as a software developer, but after a while, kind of really got into the business side of technology, and here we are doing what is now the 6th or 7th company for me, and probably the 4th for my co-founder and partner in crime, Dennis Lucio.
All right. Well, hey, we've talked in the past, and you mentioned one company that particularly stood out. Which one of those was it that was your startup that was your successful exit?
So actually had several successful exits, but there are 2 that are maybe worth mentioning. First was actually the first company I co-founded and ran, a company called Web Methods, where we pioneered the idea of what today we'd call web services and web APIs. And after a rocky start, that actually wound up becoming quite a big business. 1,200 people, a couple $100 million in revenues. We took the company public. I ran it as a public company for about 5 years. 5 years as a public company CEO, which was an interesting experience. And then actually, the other company worth mentioning, and it's probably one that you and folks in the Postgres world know, Dennis and I co-founded Enterprise DB, otherwise known as EDB, together, along with another friend of ours back almost 20 years ago. And it's been great to see that EDB has now become one of the largest independent companies in the Postgres ecosystem.
Well, independent would be a stretch based on their PE, I would think, but I mean they are definitely
Yeah.
they're definitely a great contributor to the community. There's no arguing that. But that kind of rolls us around to what you're doing now. I mean, anybody can see you're wearing the logo pgEdge.
There we go.
So, you know, obviously I know why Postgres, you know why Postgres. I think a lot of people know why Postgres, but why distributed Postgres? What is it? What is the problem you're solving for us with that?
Yeah, and that's a fantastic question. So, of course, we absolutely love Postgres, rock solid, and extensible, and these days the range of workloads that it can accommodate is pretty mind blowing. But when you think about the challenges of today's applications, they need to be always on, always available, and available to probably a global audience of users. And for that global audience of users, these applications need to be super responsive. And when you break down the challenges behind that, you have to contend with things like data latency, ultra high availability, having capacity for things like zero downtime maintenance, and stock standard Postgres doesn't support those things. You need to have a multi-master distributed Postgres if you want to take on those particular technical problems. So data latency, we run into data latency on many of the web apps that we use, where we see that it's taking a long time to load in the data into the pages as they're drawn. That's because the database is a single instance in one place on the network, probably if it's in Amazon, US East 1 here in Northern Virginia. Um, and for users that are some distance from that data center, they're going to see much longer page load times than people would like. So if you really want to address that, you have to get copies of the database closer to where the users are connecting into the network. And so these kinds of challenges are actually addressed in the NoSQL world with distributed databases uh, and with some other databases as well. But as Dennis and I surveyed the market a little while ago, we realized that this was still a gap in the Postgres world, and nobody was really attacking distributed Postgres in what we thought was a sensible and open fashion. Hence, pgEdge.
Okay. Now, this is interesting. You know, a lot of people, there's a couple of problems that they're not in our little outline here, but based on what you said, occurred to me. Um, Obviously, if I'm on the west coast of the United States and I'm trying to view a site that's in, say, South Africa or Australia, my latency might be, say, 200 milliseconds. And that's really not that bad, except that unless you're pipelining, right, it's 200 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds as you pull down these batches of data. But that's something that's technologically relatively easy to solve, even with standard Postgres, right? You can just use good old-fashioned, asynchronous replication, and then your pulls can be fast, but then it's your writes that will be slow depending on where you are geographically. That's something technologically you're trying to resolve, right? Thus the edge, where you can write to any node on this global network, and it will all sync up. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that is accurate. So it is true that with standard Postgres, you could have geographically disparate read replicas, but your writes are still going to be constrained. You're still
Right.
going to have that single trip to the database, and also from a management perspective, it's kind of awkward to. It's much easier to deal with this if you're doing it, say, within one cloud region across some availability zones. But going multi-region turns out to be fairly cumbersome. And then there's the problem of what about the write traffic?
Well, as a database guy, I have a particular concern with the idea of asynchronous multi-master. It, I mean, conflict resolution is going to be a big problem there, especially as you scale out, right? If we're dealing with 2 nodes, 3 nodes, it's one thing, but if you're dealing with 15 or 20, I'm curious how that's going to pan out. But I'm actually more curious, how are we going to solve like the GDPR problem and the laws in regards to transferring data between Europe and the States, or
Yeah,
China and the States, or whatever?
yeah. Well, let me first tackle what you mentioned about the issues of multi-master databases and conflict resolution and so forth, because that's something that we put a lot of thought and a lot of work into. So uh, uh, first of all, if you are going to do asynchronous replication, you are going to need to have some method of detecting and addressing conflicts. And so within pgEdge, we actually, as part of it, a standard Postgres extension we've created called Spark. We do have configurable conflict resolution where you can say, okay, these are the rules for how I want to handle conflicts when they occur. Now, the kind of applications that our customers are typically addressing sort of lend themselves to some kind of like sort of geographic breakup of the workload where you're probably not going to be seeing a whole ton of conflicts. If you are getting a lot of conflicts, like thousands and thousands and thousands per day, uh, you might want to think about re-architecting the schema a little bit to make the workload more amenable to this kind of distributed setup. Then some other things that we've done, we have what's effectively a form of conflict-free data types, but done in a very easy and accessible way. to handle things like running sums. So having rules like you know latest commit timestamp wins, and one overwrites the other when you've got a conflict. That doesn't work for things like aggregates and balances. You actually need to capture the deltas in both places or multiple places, and make sure that each of the deltas actually get applied, so that in the classic canonical case of uh, ATM withdrawals on two different continents. If I'm taking out $200, but my wife's in Europe taking out $300, the correct answer is to deduct $500. So you've got to merge those two deltas. So that's another thing that we take care of. Now, in terms of number of nodes, it is true that things start to get more complex and uh, require more management as the number of nodes increases. But you probably don't want to be going into the double digits. In our testing and working with early customers, we've been able to show that just having 3 to 5 strategically placed nodes around the global network is enough to make a very substantial difference in latency for users in different geographies. So then the second thing you mentioned, I don't know if you want to respond to that, but we can switch to talking about GDPR and data residency, because I think that was of some interest.
Yeah, I do want to get there. I was just going to say that when you were saying 3 to 5, I was thinking about it, and you're really talking about, West Coast, East Coast, Europe, Asia, and then maybe
Mm-hmm.
something down south,
Mm-hmm.
on the upside down portion of the world. But then for the most part, you've got it covered. I mean, realistically, because there's just outside of the oceans, right? There's just not that much difference between the nodes in terms of actual distance.
That's
And I think that over time, I think we're going to see, maybe not in your career or my career, but I think the long running solution to a lot of this is that we're going to get rid of the pipe, right? It's all going to be light beamed into the sky and beamed down, which means, 25, 30 milliseconds tops globally. But I don't know that we'll get that far in our careers. Right? I mean, we already have Starlink, which is a good start, but obviously they need competition. And then there's always the logistics of filling the night sky kind of thing. I don't know if you've ever looked out and seen the Starlink constellations; they're pretty cool.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, but the GDPR, that kind of problem, because I think that's only going to get harder, right? As the United States kind of matures the way it handles the fact that the top companies in the world are outside of the NSA, are the most violent provocateurs in terms of privacy violation. And Europe's already started to come down on that pretty hard. I would expect the United States to, follow suit. It usually does, just a little slower. How are you going to deal with those particular issues?
Yeah. So I did mention that data residency is one of the problems that you're going to have to solve with a global application. So that's something that, because of the way we've architected pgEdge, it turns out we've got a very elegant solution for. So, just to review the problem, uh, if you're looking at something like GDPR or some of the Indian regulations, other regulations around the world, or in some cases, just international customer preferences. I want to have my data here in my country, in my region, which you find in Europe a lot, uh, GDPR or not. To address that, you have to commit to making sure that the data generated by citizens of a particular country or region, that data stays
Mhm.
in that locale and is not transmitted out of it. And that can be pretty tricky. I know at one of the SaaS companies that I ran recently in the email delivery space, uh, the only way we were able to, not having a distributed Postgres, the only way we could handle that was to stand up a completely separate application stack, put that in Dublin, and it was completely disconnected from what we were doing in the rest of the world. But that's how we solved the problem. That's how a lot of people solve that problem. But if you want to have a truly global application, if you want to have things like roll ups for reporting and so forth, uh, there's a better way of doing it with a distributed solution like pgEdge, where you can be selective about what data you replicate. So with pgEdge, replication is not an all or nothing thing. You're not necessarily going to do it with the whole database. In fact,
Mhm.
you, as part of configuring pgEdge, you tell it which tables uh, actually get replicated. And you can have other controls as well. We can filter on rows, but the main way of doing it is with tables, with partitions. And so you can say quite literally, I have this global data that I want to be replicated globally, but then these other tables here, that's local data. That's my customer PII. That's the orders that those customers generated, and that can't go outside of that particular location. And so that winds up being a really elegant approach, because you're not having to stand up separate application stacks that don't talk to each other. You can keep consolidated reporting in place, to the extent that you're aggregating data and not copying European PII over to the US, for instance. Uh, and you can get the advantages of having a globally managed application uh, versus having these islands, and that's something that we're already talking to a number of customers about putting in place.
So that's interesting to me. You know, not a lawyer here, but I do know, like, so we have this interesting quandary in that you offer the ability to protect the data, which obviously you have to, otherwise you're not going to be successful in that area. But it's going to be up to the client to determine which data gets replicated. So there's a realm of discrepancy between, or potential discrepancy between what they say can be replicated and what the government says they can be replicated, and even well-meaning companies, right? I mean, Manprop has plenty of clients where we've had to go in and say, no, you can't actually do that because. And they're like,
Mm-hmm.
wait, what do you mean? We protected this over here. And we're like, yeah, but that's only, that's 95% of it. This 5% of it needs to be in there too.
Yeah.
Um, is there any worry, and maybe this is a naive question, but is there any worry of regulation coming down that says something like, okay, sure, it's the customer that picked the bad data to be replicated, but it's happening over pgEdge's infrastructure and network, and therefore there's a liability scope there.
Yeah. So we don't believe we'd have liability. We're providing a technology and a tool set, and then how the customer actually applies that. That we're not in the business of setting all that up for them. You know, we'll certainly provide them support and advice, but those decisions are ultimately with the customer. And in some situations, we'll be work. We already work with a number of consulting partners in different parts of the world, and so they might be providing that advice. In which case, maybe their liability picture is a little different.
Okay, fair enough. So I mean, you're providing the car. You're not providing the method in which they use the car. That's up to them. All right. So, Edge, not just pgEdge, but Edge is kind of a marketing term. It's a buzzword. Are we running on the edge? Do we have Edge apps? Things like that. Um, how do you think the more, Postgres is growing very quickly. I mean, although actually, I don't think it's arguable. Postgres on its own is pretty boring, right? Postgres is the opportunity to make something interesting. It's not what's interesting in itself. So, for example, pgvector, Spock. For those who are my more loyal, dedicated listeners, Sloaney. That's just a jab at yawn. Um, those types of things. But as as these newer, well, you got your time scale, you got Postgres, which has been around forever, you got pgvector, which is relatively new. But what do you think? Like, the big buzzword now is AI. That's not AI. It's not. But and machine learning, which is just another marketing term for automated data analysis. Um, do you think that those types of new to the common person, the lay person, all they're hearing now is AI, AI, AI. You watch, I think it was the Apple event where they talk about all this AI, and none of it was new. It's just now that's the buzzword. How do you think this is going to affect, say, the next 5 years with Postgres deployments, the type of data that we're going to be processing, and how to make that fundamentally useful and not evil?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of ways to unpack that. One is, uh, there's a tremendous amount of data that's held in Postgres databases, and many of these new AI applications need access to that. So, are you going to uh, uh, couple up Chat GPT type conversational technology with agents that know how to go into Postgres databases? Well, that's probably already happening. People are already doing that somewhere. Uh, but more generally, I think uh, there's opportunity for applications that we haven't even thought of. So one of the things we're excited about is you mentioned PG Vector. The combination of PG Vector and pgEdge could be pretty compelling for applications like in fintech, fraud detection and things like that, where you need to be doing that sort of similarity matching and pattern detection, and you need to do it really fast. So you can do it out at the edge. You can use PG Vector to get the vector embeddings out to databases that are managed by pgEdge, and and have something that's really performant, really effective. Uh, that's just one example in fintech. So I think we're going to see an explosion of all kinds of applications, and we'll see Postgres sometimes front and center in that, but more often than not, under the hood, serving up the data that makes all of this possible.
So this next question, how can we empower developers to more easily plug Postgres into their applications? And I want to preface this question. I deal with a lot of developers. In fact, I would argue that command prompt makes the majority of its money fixing developers' mistakes. That's because, and I believe that this is not because the developers are inherently bad, not at all. I believe it's because we empower developers to more easily plug Postgres into their whatever, because it's no longer a thought process. It's a checkbox. Are you running MySQL, Postgres, MongoDB, whatever, right? And I'm running Postgres, and I want to connect, and I don't even know what I'm doing. I just know that I'm developing the next biggest, greatest widget that's going to probably go bankrupt, but hopefully not within, so I can get my 5-year return. And I launch into Postgres, and then they do their MVP, their minimally viable product. They get some funding, and then they need to scale. And we go in, and we're like, "This, what in the world were you thinking?" Right? And I know
Mm-hmm.
Jan's run into this before. There's it, and I'm sure that any database person knows what I'm talking about. And the reason I'm being so hard on this is that I talk to all these companies. We need to empower the developer. We need to make it easier for the developer. We need to make the tools for the developer. But they have completely forgotten, how about educating the developer? How about, okay, they're in Java, that's great, but they still need to understand the platform they're using. And just because they know how to code to JDBC and Hibernate doesn't mean they understand the platform that they're using. And then therefore they're going to make these mistakes with the database itself. It doesn't matter what the database is, whether it's Postgres, Microsoft SQL, legacy Oracle, whatever. But how do you feel about that? I mean, business wise, the whole empower, make it easier for the developer. Aren't we forgetting large segments of a population that already know what they're doing when we always say it that way?
Well, I think first of all, if you look at the developer community, there are an awful lot of developers out there, uh, and not that many know Postgres to any great amount of detail. And so, the developer community itself is enormous. The number of developers who are familiar with Postgres is actually, in relative terms, quite tiny. And so we've got to find ways to grow that. And so I think, to your point, a lot more education is no doubt a good thing. Uh, but I think when we talk about empowering developers, uh, there are things that, there are directions that various companies and groups of developers and open source projects are taking that I think are really promising. So uh, the the whole infrastructure and plumbing piece, that's not something that the average developer should have to do. It's like, well, okay, having to set up servers and get Postgres running on a server and all of that, being able to approach that from the point of view of having a serverless service where I don't have to worry about the details of where Postgres is actually running and what it's running on and what AWS EC2 instance size it happens to be running on, like all of that detail that can be taken care of. I do think that for non-trivial projects, it it is important that you have at least one architect or senior developer on the team who actually understands the fundamentals and can point people in the right direction. But in terms of you know getting code going, getting things working, there's more work that can be done. So these directions with serverless, love some of the work that Neon is doing in that area, for instance. And I think things like Postgres are great as well. We're big fans of Postgres. So it does turn out a lot of transactional style applications. Really just need some form of the CRUD matrix. So model that and then go generate that out of Postgres, and then your developers are just working with something that they already know how to do, and that's work with a REST API. Uh, uh, as somebody who helped pioneer web services, I'm biased, but I'm a big fan of web APIs for everything. Uh, so so I think that there are things that we can do, and it shouldn't be the case that everybody who wants to be using Postgres in their application, or everybody who's working on an application that uses Postgres, it shouldn't have to be an in-depth Postgres expert.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, that would be like, just because, I mean, like, if you can convince your mother or sister or whatever to run Linux, right? They don't need to be a Linux expert to use it. They just have to be capable of running a Windows-like interface because they all work the same anyway. But I think where I start to get a little bit flustered about it is if we take a step back and we say, okay, in the field, if I cut myself, let's say I'm out hiking or something, can I stitch myself up? Sure. Would I want to? No, but I certainly could. But would it be better if I went to someone who actually knew what they were doing to stitch myself up?
Mm-hmm.
Who actually was practiced, trained, educated, certified, insured, all that stuff? And that's where, and this goes all the way back to the beginning days of, say, Heroku. I see this, I hear it all the time. I hear the Heroku really changed the approachability of Postgres for developers. No, it didn't. Heroku made my life a pain in the ass by not doing it correctly for the developer, right? Because they made it so simple that I'll give you this. They expose Postgres to a whole level and population of really talented people in terms of being web developers or developers writing to a web API. No argument, no question. But they never bothered to consider that the simpler you make it on this end, the more complicated you make it on this end, which is why Heroku is largely unused now. And companies like mine will always say, don't do it that way. Right? Yes, you're absolutely right. You're going to have some database expertise, at least on contract. That's what we're here for. But if you truly want to scale, you truly want to do this or that, you want to build it up and out, you need someone, like you said, who actually knows what they're doing. And so I don't know. I guess I'm a little bit concerned about simplifying versus dumbing down. They're two
Mhm.
very different things. One is good and one is inherently a very bad thing, right?
Right, right. Yeah, but I think there's a difference between sort of having the understanding uh, and then yeah, having to deal with like purely mechanical things that are tedious and could be taken care of in some sort of serverless offering or managed cloud offering. Great example in some of the stuff that we've done in our pgEdge cloud offering. One of the things we wanted to do was make it easy to stand up a cluster of databases across multiple cloud regions. And actually, one of the things we wanted to make sure was that uh, we would make it really easy to get the configuration correct and secure, because it's so easy to
Sure.
you know not not configure things correctly in the cloud and leave your databases wide open. And so uh, we have software behind the scenes that first of all you lay out on a map where you want to have your cluster nodes, and then you hit the magic do it button to go provision everything. And the amount of stuff that we're able to take care of behind the scenes, you know, configuring all of the EC2 instances, getting the Postgres database installed onto each of them correctly, then setting up the security groups and the VPCs and all of that good stuff. There's uh, a mind-numbing amount of detail in all of that, which it's great if a tool can just go take care of that for you. Now,
Sure.
it doesn't mean that you should be absolved from having an understanding of what's actually happening, but you don't have to do that grunt work of setting everything up manually.
No, and I would agree with that. I mean, from core Postgres perspective, there's a few things that seem like it should. Partitioning, for example, it. I should be able to define rules for partitions, and partitions get automatically created as things go on, right? I don't have to go in and check or have a monitoring script or anything like that. Vacuum's a great example of there should be an agent that sits there and watches what Vacuum is doing and adjusts based on machine learning various parameters for Vacuum, whether it's column, table, or even system wide, to ensure that within certain thresholds it just works, right? So I do appreciate that perspective. I think it's more, I mean, even to this day, I can take a phone call once every 2 months where someone says our application is slow. We have 2 billion records. And out of my mouth is, let me guess, you have it in one table. And they immediately like, well, yeah, right? And it's that type of thing to me. It's like, okay, look, you had a table, you knew it was going to grow by nature of design. Did it not consider to you to look at how do we deal with large sets of data in Postgres, right? Just Google the term and immediately it'll come back partitioning, right? It's that type of thing that I think is a little bit, as someone who sits so deeply in the database side of things, is frustrating. Um, Now we talked about the serial entrepreneur. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. We talked about the serial entrepreneur. You said 6, 7 companies. Um, you know, your first one, you started it with your wife, your first company. What was
That's
that
right.
experience? I work with my wife, so Scotch to you, sir. What was that like for you? How did that change the dynamic?
Oh wow. So where to start with that? Uh, so the first thing I would say about working with your wife is, don't try this at home. Your mileage may vary. Uh,
I am not a lawyer. How many disclaimers can we come up with? I am not a
yeah.
lawyer.
Uh, but my wife and I feel very blessed that uh, our relationship ultimately was strengthened by working together and having this joint shared experience of starting this company and then taking it public. Uh, uh, there were some stresses and strains that came out of that. You're probably aware of the data. For companies that are started by a husband and a wife, you know, the odds that A, the company's successful, and B, the couple stays together, pretty low. So
Yeah.
that's why we feel blessed. We uh, we won on both of those counts. And at times it was just extraordinary, and and having your life partner be doing it with you, doing this great thing with you. There was a lot of joy in that. Then things like time, space, and motion, particularly once we started having kids, that that just became really really tough. And ultimately, um, and at the time, sadly for my wife had to step back, and I was CEO, she was head of marketing, and she had to step back to uh, raise our kids and keep things together on the home front, while still trying to stay as engaged professionally as she could. It was, overall it was a great blessing for us. It worked for us. May not work for everybody, and we're just very very happy that we were able to do that together and have that together. Uh, funny story. One of the things we felt was really important was to be absolutely professional at work, and it's like, so we knew that our colleagues, our staff members, would not want to sort of be exposed to the personal relationship that my wife and I had. Um, and so we just kept it all very professional, and played it straight, to the extent that after we'd grown to the extent where we had a head of human resources, uh, a new hire who'd been with us for maybe just a few weeks, very sheepishly went to the head of HR and said, "I hate to say this, but I think there might be something going on between Karen and Philip." It's like, funny you should mention that. They're actually married.
Have been for years. You actually inadvertently brought something up that I was going to point out. So you said you were the CEO and she was the head of marketing. If I were to give any advice um, to a couple trying to start a business together, it would be have different gifts. So
Yes.
in command prompt scenario, I am not the CEO. I am not the chief boss. It's not my gift. I'm
Mhm.
more of the, oh, you don't know how to swim? Push and let's see if you can swim. Amanda is the chief executive officer. I am the president and the CTO, which plays to my benefits directly, which are vision and providing overall technological insight to the operational team that supports our clients. And that would be in my mind, and that's probably one of the reasons you were probably successful as well, is that if you have separate gifts, you don't bash, as long as you accept what those gifts are, right? You're not sitting there going, this is how you market. You might say, what about this idea? And then she just looks at you and shakes her head, because you're a CEO and she's in marketing, right? And I'm sure you've probably experienced that personally as well. But the fact that you had separate gifts allows you to be successful in that environment, and a mutual respect, right? just knowing that this isn't where you're talented, so be quiet. you know. Um, so what do you think? What did this company that you started? It was the Web Methods. Is that the one you started with your wife, or was it a different one?
That was the company. Yeah.
Okay. And why at the time? I mean, you and I have been doing this long enough to know that first financed or the last one there. What made Web Methods the thing that it was at that time? What made it so successful?
So we were the first to recognize that uh, these newfangled web protocols, HTTP, etc., and then XML, that they could be used for solving problems that had vexed technologists for decades. So being able to use technologies that were being used just between the browser and the server between applications to solve the application to application communication problem. So we were one of the first to realize that you could use web protocols to do that, and so we had somewhat of a first mover advantage. And It was enough to ultimately, it was pretty rocky for the first couple of years, but that allowed us to build a business on top of that. So it was some amount of good luck and good timing there. But uh, One of the things I would say to entrepreneurs is, really look for something that is different from what everybody else is doing. So right now, don't be the 10th AI startup trying to revolutionize medicine or something. Look for opportunities that are maybe a little bit obvious to you, but you don't see anybody else doing them.
So, and I would agree with that. Although I do think there's more room in the Postgres space just by nature of what it is. If we look at what pgEdge is doing, it's a little bit of a holy grail. The only company, well, not the only company, but a company of note that has successfully deployed multi-master, and they do it very differently than what we're talking about with Spock, is Oracle, right? I mean, Microsoft SQL to a certain extent, but Oracle, I mean, that's who you think of. You think of RAC, right? And
Well, not just
although,
that, but more importantly, Golden Gate, uh,
yes,
which is actually highly analogous to what we're doing with Spock, because Golden Gate is logical asynchronous replication with conflict resolution.
yeah, but I mean, Golden Gate also's got CDC and it's got, I mean, it works. I mean, Golden Gate works with Postgres, for example,
Yeah.
right? Whereas Spock, I guess technically through the use of FDWs or something like that, you could do something really weird. And don't give Jan any ideas. The but the point I was actually making is actually to your guidance, right? Find something that is at least novel at a minimum, right? And there's nobody really in this space. I mean, even EDB with their big animal thing, they're not focusing on globally distributed data, which is a pretty big thing right now. And I think it's kind of the way it's going. I mean, for example, my offsite backups are globally distributed through a company, right? I don't, and there's a reason. It's all encrypted and all that, but there's a reason for that. It's like if the United States disappears tomorrow, I still have my data in South Africa, right? And a lot of people say to themselves, well, that would never happen. I would suggest that those people are subject to the United States U.S. history education system, which is lacking because, this stuff happens all the time. Um, I kind of got off point there, but the point I was trying to make is that with pgEdge, that is something you're addressing. You're addressing something novel, globally distributed, shrinking latency. A lot of people, I mean, that you hear that a lot now is how do I make the app go faster? And there's
Mhm.
only so fast that light can go, right? Which is why globally distributed matters. What is it? I mean, outside of this multi-master thing, because it's kind of like the Holy Grail. What is the thing that pgEdge is going to give us, or at least hope to give us, that we're not expecting? What's the button, the knob, whatever, the app I can write because of the hard work that you're engineering that we're not expecting?
Yeah, that's another great question. So I would say that what what is possible and going to be possible with pgEdge, a range of applications beyond what we're thinking about today, where uh, being able to knock down the latency problem, being able to uh, deal with data residency and have smart ways of replicating data around the globe. We're a tool provider fundamentally. Uh, the great applications are going to come from people who develop applications on top of what we do. So, can I predict what those are going to look like? No, I can't. But am I confident that there's going to be a whole bunch of things that we've just not thought of? Absolutely.
Does pgEdge have like a traffic director? Like I'm coming from the state, so it automatically directs me over to a state node, or is that something that would have to be developed?
Uh, you're going to take care of that, on the customer side, through various means, DNS, whatever. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, we, at least for now, we wanted to sort of put that flexibility in the hands of the customer.
No, and that makes sense. I was just, I could see over time, this would be over time, but pgEdge 4.0 kind of thing, where you've gotten to the point where due to geolocation of IPs and stuff, all it just knows where to go.
Mhm.
Unless you specifically tell it not to. So you made
Yeah,
three
actually,
six.
there is
Go ahead.
something that we're already doing with platforms like Cloudflare, where uh, we've built a little bit of intelligence into our APIs, so that when you're accessing pgEdge from Cloudflare workers, you've got a bit of code, you're running it as a Cloudflare worker. Uh, uh, that Cloudflare worker could run anywhere on the Cloudflare network, and they've got I don't know a couple of hundred points of presence where
Mhm.
it could run. Uh, so interesting problem. It's like yeah, if you want to solve the data latency problem and you want to do it in conjunction with a platform like Cloudflare Workers, then you need to have that worker connect to the closest database node, the closest pgEdge node. And
Mhm.
so uh, our, our cloud guys came up with some clever code that actually starts looking at things like Latin long, and the things that we can get out of the HTTP header for the Cloudflare worker request. It's like, okay, well, apparently we're running at this lat and long. Okay, what is the closest pgEdge node? And then we connect to that. Uh, so,
Interesting.
so we're already doing, just as you were talking about, it's like, well, actually, wait. uh, when we're working with a platform like Cloudflare Workers, we are doing some amount of traffic direction based on where that code is actually running uh, on the Cloudflare network.
All right. Well, we've talked a lot about pgEdge, and we're closing up on our time here. So there's a couple things that I wanted to get to. Um, the first one is so Spock, which is the primary component for your multi-master system, which is based on BDR, is no longer open source. Now, I'm not here to pass judgment. Do what you want with your business, but I'm curious how kind of the thought process behind it. Why not just make it say GPL or something versus I think it's a Confluence license, something like that.
Yeah, it's a community license. It's actually the very same license that Confluent uses, the Confluent community license.
Mhm.
Uh, and we would say it is open source. It's open source, lowercase o, lowercase s, however you want to characterize that. uh, any customer or anybody else for that matter can do anything they would like with that spot code, and our license imposes no restriction on them. The one restriction we have is to say, if you go stand this up in the cloud as a competing service to what we offer, well, we're we're not going to permit that under the terms of this license, and that's just the one restriction. Don't go field a competing service with us in the cloud. And if you look at what a lot of uh, companies that otherwise would be called open source are doing today, that that is exactly the same model. It's the same model that Timescale is on, and a whole bunch of other companies as well. Uh, and we would love to just make this completely open source, but boards and investors need to see some level of protection, and we don't have to be particularly paranoid about the likes of the large cloud providers, because they do have a history of having taken unrestricted open source products, standing them up with no value add, and then using it to compete with the company that actually put that technology into the market in the first place.
Yeah, no, like I said, no judgment, just trying to feel it out. I do know, although it's funny, interesting that you brought up timescale. To my knowledge, timescale is just Apache. They don't have any limitation on the code that they have released.
Yeah, if you go have a look, you'll see that there's I don't know exactly the terms that they're using, but there's unrestricted timescale, and then there's some sort of enterprise version, and that's under
Yes,
a
that's true.
license.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. All right, so and then the a lot of people don't know pgEdge. It's funny, you came to me via Dennis. Dennis and I have known each other. I didn't actually know you were a co-founder of EDB. Obviously, I knew Dennis was. And then there's what is Andy and Jim
And yeah,
Olginski.
yep.
And I knew Dennis and I know Jan. I've known them both for 2 decades. But you tend to, it looks like with this, your current staff you've worked with in the past. I mean, a couple of your marketing folks that I've met, they worked with you in the past. Obviously, you've worked with Dennis in the past, which means you've worked with Jan in the past. How did you get the band back together? you know?
Well, the cool thing, it's not getting one band back together; it's actually getting several bands back together, and we're just thrilled that we've been able to put this team together from you know a bunch of great people that we've worked with in the past, sometimes in as many as three different companies before pgEdge. Uh, so so it's I think allowed us to move a lot more quickly, because we didn't have to do that storming and norming stuff as a team figures out how to work together, because we all we knew each other, we knew uh, how we all like to work together. So I think that's been extraordinarily helpful for us in getting pgEdge off the ground and launched and into the market in the way that we have. Uh, but I think we're actually at the point where we're starting to reach the outer limits of our networks, and actually that's a good thing, because we're bringing in people who are new to us as well as new to the team, and so that's bringing in a diversity of thought and different ways of doing things on top of this great base of a bunch of people who've worked together in some cases for several decades.
So, and this just popped in my head, but with your traditional startup fund, is the plan? Are we doing a traditional exit, or are we doing an IPO, or what's the 3, 5, 10 for pgEdge? Is this your swan song? That kind of thing.
uh, uh, who knows on this one? So uh, look, in each of the companies that I've been involved with, I've had a very simple mantra, like, let's build a great business and a great company, and good things will come out of that. Whether that's a great strategic M&A exit or maybe an IPO, right? But I've seen too many entrepreneurs like literally do the build to flip thing, or just become very fixated on a particular kind of exit to a particular kind of company, or maybe even a specific company. It's like, well, what happens if that plan doesn't work out and that company doesn't acquire you? It's like, well,
Mhm.
where are you going to be? Whereas if you've just focused on building a great company behind a great idea and a great market need, it's like, good things are going to happen. So that's the philosophy that I have. I know Dennis shares that. And look, what we want to do over the next 1 year, 5 years, 10 years is just make it easier for organizations to deploy distributed databases to solve these really pressing problems of how do you manage and run a global application that has to be always on, always available, and super responsive. So we just want to make distributed databases easier and more accessible, and at the same time, expand the Postgres ecosystem, because as I said at the outset, we love Postgres, and some of us have been involved with Postgres like you for the better part of 25 years.
Oh, yeah, 97. I even had some Ingress and original Postgres experience long before PostgreSQL even came into existence. You said something interesting there, the idea of building a company to be acquired, and then what happens if that company doesn't acquire you. I literally talked to you and I, Dennis, Jan, we're all of a certain decade of wisdom. Um, and
Well,
I've
maybe.
talked to, well, at least we like to feel that way. And I've talked to a lot of younger entrepreneurs, and I've literally had this conversation. We are building something for Amazon to acquire us, right? And I'm thinking to myself, what kind of goal is that, right? Don't get me wrong. If you get acquired, great. If someone came along, I mean, I'm not going to lie. If someone came to me and said, "Look, love what Command Prompt's doing. I'll give you an exit package," I would strongly consider it. I've been doing it almost 30 years, right? But that was never the goal. The goal was to create this stable, well-respected, profitable company, and that's what we've done. Um, it seems to me that there's been a switch. When I was younger, when I was in my 20s and early 30s, and people would talk about VC, you talked about your exit because that's kind of the nature of it. But it was always about building something interesting. It wasn't about capitalizing on investment to derive your highest acquisition target, right? It wasn't about that. It was about, we're building something cool. And because that something cool happened, you either were successful or were not. And sometimes you were ahead of your time. I think there was a company, I might have the name wrong, but I think it was called Peabody. And it was back in the early 2000s, and what it did is what Grubhub or Instacart, what those companies do now. They were just ahead of their time. People weren't going to just automatically have all their food delivered. But do you think that there is a value in let me back up. I recently had a conversation with two privacy advocates. And the challenge of these privacy advocates is they're trying to get people to care and understand why privacy is important. And we have gotten to a point where many in society just don't care or don't understand why privacy is important. To the point where these two individuals, much to my depression, both agreed that education won't do any good on this matter. People are just apathetic to it. They don't care. They only superficially care that Google knows literally everything about you, right? It's only a superficial care. In our world, there's a lot of the same things when you're talking about building something. Is it worth the energy to seek out those young founders who show promise but understand that profit is the reward, not the goal?
Yeah, I think we're a year or two into a great reset. So the the kind of person who's founding a company today is probably a little different from most of the people founding companies, 5 5 years ago, 2 years ago. So the I think we underestimate the kind of warping effect all this free money has had on
Mhm.
people, particularly in the technology industry. So it sort of goes back to you know money effectively being free, like literally, the Fed pursuing a zero interest rate policy for a very long time, and without getting political about this, uh, that forced lots and lots of money into riskier assets, which found its way into a lot more venture capital funds being founded and existing ones growing to very large, unsustainable sizes. It's like, how does a VC fund manage $1 billion effectively? Um,
Mhm.
uh, so, so we've got a big reset in the tech industry where I think things are just going back to basics. So, we're under no illusions here at pgEdge as to what we have to do. We have to hit certain milestones if we expect to attract further investment. Uh,
Mhm.
what and that's the way that the VC industry used to operate, and it's going back to operating that way. And I think that's taken some of the younger folks a bit by surprise. Uh, but this is the way the tech industry operated for a long time until money effectively became free, and now it's not free, and you actually have to be disciplined.
Well, I don't disagree with that. And this is something that's happened two or three times since 1999, right? But even
It has
through,
happened 2 or 3 times. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there, but it
no,
has happened
please.
2 or 3 times. But yeah, the last time it happened in a meaningful way was 2008, 2009,
Right.
and that's 14 years ago. So you have to be into your 30s to have actually experienced that as an adult. So I think that has a profound effect on how people are thinking about the current circumstances we're in. But I think back to your main point, uh, the, you have to be if you're doing it today, given how hard things like fundraising are, um, you have to be doing it for reasons other than, hey, I'm going to get acquired by Amazon and get a lot of money, right?
Right. No, I agree. In fact, before we got on this recording, I was on the phone with a wealth manager, not for me. It was more of an investigatory call. And we actually talked about how where we're at today with essentially expensive money. You have to really work for it now, especially if you're a startup. We had 14, 15 years of relatively easy money, right? Ever since, like you said, 08, 09. And although 08, 09 was a reset, if you look historically, it's usually every seven-ish kind of years something happens and adjusts. Maybe the market drops or whatever the case is, so that people kind of reset their expectations. But like you just said, which is I think very important, is that if to actually have a concrete memory of what it was like to work for your money, quote unquote, you got to, I mean, realistically, it's not even your 30s, it's really your 40s, right? Because you were a teenager when it happened last time, otherwise,
Yeah.
you know? All right. Well, hey, Philip, this has been fantastic. Is there anything that you would like to add before we close out?
I would just like to say thank you, and this has been a great deal of fun.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. And with that, this has been More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Thank you, Philip. I hope PG Edge is successful.
Thank you, JD.